Hello, everyone. Welcome to week two, Thinking Unpaid Work. I just want to start with a few announcements. The first one is that I'm going to repost the quiz from Friday. Apparently, there was some problem accessing it. I thought I sent an email through Blackboard, but apparently that didn't happen. So I'm not sure why Blackboard doesn't send the announcement. But I'm going to repost it, and I'll just send you emails from now on rather than trying it through Blackboard. Second thing is start thinking about your applied essays. So if you want to do an applied essay this week, or you have 3 of them to do, you only have 4 weeks left to do it. So get on it. So contact me this week, email me, text me, whatever, and we'll talk about what you're gonna do this week. Okay. So let's just jump right into it. You'll see on the third slide, I listed some terms and concepts. That's what we're going to be talking about this week. I'll use these things throughout, try to explain them as I go. So the first slide discusses labor power as a unique commodity. This is an idea that you guys ran into last week a whole bunch, that human activity is the source of all social wealth. But then labor power, the specific type of work activity that we do when we're being paid a wage, is the source of all value, economic value. This, of course, is measured in time, and the amount of time that it takes to produce a thing, a commodity, on average, is called socially necessary labor time. That is what determines the value of an object. So, for example, if the socially necessary labor time of an object is 30 minutes, let's say it takes 30 minutes of human activity to produce this hat. Okay, if it takes 30 minutes of socially necessary labor time to produce that hat, then if you produce it in 25 minutes, you can make some extra profit by either by lowering your price, and so expanding the number of people that can buy your hats, because this is the economic theory of the margin, right? If you decrease it a little bit, you can expand on the margins. Or you could sell it for the same price as all the other hats that are just like it, but you'll make extra profit that way. Okay. So in this framework, it doesn't matter if you produce that sucker, it has the same value if you produce it in 25 minutes or you produce it in 20 hours. The labor theory value does not say the more time it takes to produce a thing, the more money you can sell it for, the more value it has. Okay, if it took me 20 hours to produce that hat, I still couldn't sell it I would still sell this for the same price as all the other hats that are just like it. It would be kind of crazy for me to think I could sell for more. But this is the law of value, and what it does is it regulates production time, right? So it enforces a type of productive process. So if it takes me 20 hours to produce a hat, it's probably not going to be really worth my time, because I'm only going to be able to get 30 minutes worth of value for that hat, right, when I go to sell it. So either it means that I'm going to get out of the hat business altogether, or I'm going to look for a different type of productive system that's more in line with the technologies that other people are using to produce those hats. Okay, so and this is part of the disciplinary mechanism of the law of value, and it regulates production. It regulates the way things are produced and the work process, and it helps generalize innovation. So, for example, if one guy figured out a way to reduce the time it takes to produce those hats, that means all his competitors are at a disadvantage. And they're probably going to, at some point, they're going to have to figure out how to reduce the amount of time it takes to produce those hats. Because at some point it won't be very profitable to keep producing them, so they'll either adopt his technologies, as in the example, or maybe they'll try to reduce wages, or they'll try to do something, right? But it behooves them to adopt those productive processes. Okay, cool. So, but not only is labor power unique and creative, as Braverman talks about in the workplace, but also outside of. And this is what the piece in How Not to Skip Class discusses on page 8. That part of the reason why labor power is a unique commodity is because we have the ability to adapt to our circumstance. So, if the boss, for example, does reduce our wages, um, we can figure out a way in our own lives to either reduce our consumption patterns or maybe we'll organize it into unions or some other form of social power and demand that our wages stay where they were or go up or whatever. But we have the ability to creatively respond. So that means that you can reduce for the capitalists, right? It's one place where you can always try to cut under certain circumstances, of course. If workers aren't well organized or whatever, as they haven't been in the United States for a while. But and you can replace commodities, stuff that we'd buy, with unpaid work. So, for example, if let's say your paycheck got cut, that's terrible, right? But instead of maybe you ate out 2 or 3 times a week, instead of doing that, maybe now you eat at home, or maybe instead of eating, fancy organic lettuce, now you eat just the regular old lettuce, right? Or whatever. There's all sorts of creative ways that we can respond to our circumstances, which means that's why we call labor power variable capital, because it varies, and you can, and that's one place where you can always cut, as I said before. Okay. And this is a key feature, actually, of capitalism. So, prior to industrial capitalism, work and family life, work and home, that division wasn't very clear or clear at all. Work was very much integrated with leisure and family life and what have you. There was no what they call this in Marxist theories. There's no separation between reproduction and production. So your family worked in the fields with you or did other type of productive activities. The home was seen also as a site of work. And yeah, with capitalism, we have, when I'll talk about this a little bit later, you have the separation of the workspace from the home space, right? This is the rise of, you also then have the rise of leisure, but part of this has to do with the way in which capitalism remunerates or pays workers. So under former systems, you can think about feudalism, right? There was certain obligations that the lord had to the serf, that they had to provide them. If there was a bad year for food, the lord was obligated to help make sure that they could make it through the winter or the tough period or whatever. And there's all sorts of these very material obligations. You can also look at the early organization of households in the United States and production. Apprentices lived with the masters, and they, as part of their wage, was receiving food and board. They would even drink together during the day, right? And you had longer work hours, but they were also integrated with moments of leisure and rest and what have you. With the rise of industrial capitalism, you have the separation of work and leisure, as I stated before, but this also corresponds to the monetization of the wage. So the wage becomes not a bundle. You don't get food or housing from your employer. You get a set amount of money every week, and then it's your responsibility as the worker to figure out how to spend that money to reproduce yourself. That's part of the genius of capitalism, is that it doesn't really care about the way that you reproduce yourself, just as long as you do it. Or at least this is kind of I'm telling you the kind of standard narrative. And the ability to freely decide how you're going to reproduce yourself is kind of what we call bourgeois freedom. So you can buy Suave shampoo, or you can buy maybe another new shampoo, Dr. Bronner's, right? You can, those are your choices. You can live on the west side, you can go on the east side, right? Okay. Okay, so now I want to get into this. What the difference is between unpaid labor and unpaid work. So I'm gonna have to read from my notes for this one because. So unpaid labor, the basic definition I gave you on the slides is the extra amount of time a worker works beyond what is socially necessary to reproduce themselves or perhaps their family. Because remember, if every commodity's value is defined by how much socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce them, that's also the value of labor power of my ability of my work. Right? I'm not paid for what I do. I'm paid for to reproduce myself and show up the next day. So I'm gonna get into my notes because I think I probably explained this better in there. In Marxist theory, unpaid labor is the amount of extra time a worker must work beyond their paycheck in order to get their paycheck, but is not paid the full amount of the value they produce. Okay, just bear with me. For example, same item, let's call it a widget, or we can call it this hat. We were sticking with this hat, I guess, before. Takes 30 minutes to produce and costs $10. For the moment, we're gonna say that value is price. It's just a little bit easier. That's not really the case, but just stick with me. Some of that value comes from the tools used to make it, but the rest of it comes from the labor or working to produce it. Okay, so if I'm producing this on a sewing machine, the amount of labor, socially necessary labor time embodied in that sewing machine, it expresses its labor time or its value in all the stuff that it produces. We're gonna just forget about that bit for a second. And let's just say that the worker produces all the $10 worth of value. But let's say if a worker produces $20 worth of stuff in an hour, so in this case 2 hats, but is only paid $9 an hour, that's the minimum wage in New York State, then the rest goes to the capitalist. So that is surplus value. So if a worker produces $20 worth of stuff, it's only paid $9, the capitalist gets $11 as profit in this very circumscribed and not completely accurate example. So money can be translated into time. There's an interchangeability between time and money. So the worker produces enough stuff to cover their wages in 27 minutes. That's how much it takes to produce stuff. 20 hours, and I have the calculations here, but with 33 minutes being unpaid labor. So the other 33 minutes they work in an hour is all unpaid. And unpaid labor is where what we call surplus value comes from. The extra amount, which is just what I called unpaid labor. Unpaid labor, surplus value are roughly the same thing. And there's this gap between paid labor and unpaid labor that is related to what I was talking about before with the cost of labor power, our capacity to work. Because if you can figure out a way, if the cost of me reproducing myself is low, if food is relatively inexpensive, or even or housing or whatever, then I can get paid less. But if I'm working in a productive system where it's really productive, for example, then we can produce a lot of crap. So that's where the gap comes from, because a worker is not paid for the work they do; they're paid the amount of money it takes to reproduce themselves, and that, of course, is not a set number. It's the product of class struggle. It's the product of cultural expectations. So in some instances, it was reasonable for a male factory worker to assume and expect that his wage could support himself, his spouse, probably a wife, and probably a couple or 3 or 4 kids or whatever. That was the expectation. And if they tried to reduce cost below that. If they try to reduce wages below that, there would be reaction and struggle. Okay, but there does seem to be some certain types of lower limits. So you can only reduce wages so much if if like most of us, we have to resort to getting most of the things that we use to reproduce ourselves on the market. You can, of course, as I said before, replace some of that with work, but if you have to work a lot already, it could become really really intense. You can imagine working 6 hours a week plus also trying to produce food in your home cheaply. Trying to find other sources of cheap calories, you're gonna end up eating ramen, right? And that's it, which is pretty crappy. And that process pushing the price of labor so low that workers can't reasonably reproduce themselves within the given social their social positions and their relations and whatever. Um, that's called immiseration. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure I talked about this, but I want to go back to talking about the law of value. Um, so what the law of value does is if hold on one second. I'm going to pause this and go back to the beginning and see if I actually